Nice roads, nice wagons, money talks, but I often sneak hanging. My God is purple garden, green ashes, ought to be king, but no author. Montgomery, barking at the lawler. One shot could bring a halt to your consciousness. Blame it all on my father. Cool is rather my childhood. Usually what we do here. Have a minute for you. Everybody is cool here. Don't you wanna be too? The snow love laws. Just really trying to run it through. No, snow love laws. Just trying to get this money through. Nice roads, nice wagons, money talks, but I often sneak hanging. My God is purple garden, green ashes, ought to be king, but no author. Montgomery, barking at the lawler. One shot could bring a halt to your consciousness. Blame it all on my father. Cool is rather my childhood. Usually what we do here. Have a minute for you. Everybody is cool here. Don't you wanna be too? Snow love laws. Just really trying to run it through. Snow love laws. Just trying to get this money through.
You a hater. I can't say your name on here, but you a hater. You know who you are. Sheesh, man. People get a couple Instagram followers and then start acting up. I tell you. What's going on, y'all? Hope all is well. Oh, yeah, we don't want to do that. That's splitting the joint up. Yeah. Hope all is well. Hope all is well. Yeah, man, you know, I be jamming sometimes. Let's see. Hope y'all doing all right on lockdown. You know what I'm saying? Just call Mr. Josh. Yo, Mr. Josh, what's going on?
How we doing?
I'm chilling, man. Chilling. You know, everybody's going crazy because I finally got a shave, you know. But it was bound to happen. Oh, man. All right. They said they want me to teach something. Okay, so looking at packet for week 4 through 5. Hopefully you guys all got it. We left off discussing the Monroe Doctrine. So I want to read the second half of that document and review it. And Mr. Josh is going to have some visuals for an in-depth breakdown. Once again, you guys can DM me your work, take pictures of it, send it to me, reach out. I've been giving credit to people who've been reaching out and letting me know that they've been working on the packet and showing it to me and all that good stuff, because grades are going to be due fairly soon for the rest of the third quarter. Your grade can't go down, but it can be boosted. And, you know, I just want y'all to know I'm taking 45 minutes out of my day to stop day trading just to teach you guys this. So be grateful, because I could be trading right now. Thought about calling out. All right. So, Mr. Josh, you want to give us a refresher, a recap? Oh, wait. There he is. All right.
Yeah. So, as you guys remember, last week we were talking about the Monroe Doctrine. This was a speech, something given by James Monroe, who was the president of the United States long time ago. And he basically said that there were countries in North and South America that were being messed with, that the Europeans were talking to. So the British, the French, the Spanish, all those people. And he said in so many words, y'all step. Don't mess with us. This is our side. You stay on your side of the ocean. We're going to stay on our side. No big deal. So we're talking about how he said that, what he meant, and what happened after he said it going on. If the Europeans listened, or if they just said, nah, we're going to do what we want.
Cool. So in layman's terms, it was about territory. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Josh. It's about territory, right? The Western Hemisphere, which contains North and South America, okay? The Americans wanted control over that, and they didn't want European influence over that. They didn't want colonization. They wanted to essentially be who was in charge of that entire Western hemisphere. Two reasons for that. One, trade, right? They wanted the priority on trade. The second reason, protection, right? We already talked about the sea, the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans that flank America, and that's part of why America's been so successful fighting wars. It's very difficult to fight wars across bodies of water, particularly large ones. So if I can ally with all the other nations in my hemisphere, then I'm at no threat of being taken over. So part of the reason why America has endured for so long as a strategic power has to do with the fact that we have all our allies in the same region, right? Versus where they are in Europe, where you had literally countries that were flanking each other or next to each other, fighting one another. And Mr. Josh, can you show Europe just one more time? I just want
Yeah.
everybody to get this because Europe is so densely divided, right? You have all these countries that are right next to each other that might fight one another, right? Whereas America, our only true immediate enemies would be Canada and Mexico, but they're our allies. So we really have nothing to worry about from an attack. We're kind of buffered, and that's very important. Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So, as Mr. Pugh said, we only border 2 countries. But if you look at Europe, they are neighbors with a whole lot of people. So with a lot of these countries, they're going to start fighting, they're going to start messing with each other. And because we are so far away from them, because there's the Atlantic Ocean between us and Europe, we have a lot less to worry about and we have a lot less enemies to have to fight in the future.
So that's very important, guys. When we're thinking about strategy, and I wish we were going into the world wars, but we're not. So, yeah. All right, I'm picking up on page 4. This is where we left off last time when we were reading the Monroe Doctrine. I know it's extra dense. Here's what I would encourage you to do. As we read this and as we break down terms and break down text, write notes in the margin that can help you answer these questions later on when we're not around. Make notes on the meaning of words, make notes on things we're talking about, because it'll be super, super helpful to you guys. All right, so as we go, I'm going to start with we owe. We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their European nations part to extend their system to any portion of this Western hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety with the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power. We have not interfered and shall not interfere. So they're making kind of a deal here, Mr. Josh. I'm going to call you back. I'm going to see if anybody can explain to me what kind of deal Monroe is trying to make with these guys. Yeah, it might be Stewart. Let's see. Who to get. Boom. Here's a good start.
Hey, Teach.
What up? What's popping?
All right. So, what I feel like what they're trying to say with that bubbled in word, admissible, the definition means peaceful. So, I think they're trying to like make, amends and make peace and stuff. That's what I'm thinking.
Okay.
Word.
That's I love the way you applied that. That's part of the response I was looking for. Great job there, right? We owe it therefore to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt. So they're saying, yeah, we're going to be peaceful. We're peaceful. We have peace with these nations. Now, if you look at this last sentence, it says, with the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. What are they saying to the Europeans?
We don't interfere what you guys go through with other countries and stuff, and we're not going to interfere unless like you threaten us, something like that.
Pretty much. Great job. Great synopsis. They're like, look, your affairs, whatever you choose to do, that's on y'all. We're not going to interfere, okay? And we don't plan on interfering. So good job there. Great breakdown. Talk to you later.
All right, bye.
So, Mr. Josh, I think she was spot on, right? This is Monroe telling the European nations, I do not plan on interfering. I will not interfere. And I have not interfered, right? Kind of saying to take this at their word.
Exactly. As we talked about last week and as we're talking about today, we basically told the Europeans, if you stay in Europe, we're not going to mess with anything that happens in Europe. If a war breaks out, if somebody starts fighting, we're going to stay off to the side. We're not going to get involved. As long as the Europeans stay out of North and South America, because that's our side, that is our friends, and that's the countries that we want to work with. So they got to stay away for us to stay away from them.
Right. Now, Mr. Josh, do you find that to be controversial?
I would say from our perspective as the United States, I think it's not controversial because that's us saying, hey, we are close to these countries. They're our friends. Um, we want to protect them. We want to work with them. So that's a very normal thing for us to do. But for these countries that have just become independent, that are trying to make these decisions for themselves, if some person walks in the room that is stronger than them, that has more money than them, that might not agree with everything they say, and they just talk to everybody and they say, hey, I make the rules now. You don't have a choice. This is just how it is.
Right.
They might
Now,
not be very happy with that.
now, one issue we did have, let's say, a disagreement or a skirmish between some prominent figures back then, right? Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. Because the French, remember, if you guys remember, in the French and Indian War, the French came to the aid of the United States. They also assisted the United States during the American Revolutionary War, right? So when fighting broke out between the French and the British, there was controversy over whether the Americans should back the French because they had received help from them before. But obviously, not Thomas Jefferson, but George Washington would essentially, I think, agree, right, with his farewell speech where he says, we don't want to have foreign entanglements. I think he would literally agree with what this Monroe Doctrine was saying. So it's important to kind of, I think, tie in those things around the history of our leaders and the things that they're talking about, okay? So if anybody has any questions, of course, remember, drop it in the chat. Me or Mr. Josh, as we're going through this, will respond to you guys because we want you guys to stay up. So take a minute, drop some questions if you have any. I want to make sure you guys understand this. So when you guys go and you're answering these questions, you guys are able to do it. And there may be a little lag, but we're monitoring and we'll get to you as soon as possible. Okay.
Yeah, so someone in the chat just asked if they're territorial. I would say yes. We're basically saying in the Monroe Doctrine, as long as you guys stay on your side, we'll stay on our side. We don't want to fight, but you got to stay over there to make sure that happens.
That was an excellent observation. That is literally a great term to apply to this to help you guys remember. When we're talking about this breakdown of the Monroe Doctrine, we're talking about territory. The United States and the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, is American territory, right? Europe, European territory. This thing is being broken up territorially, and territory is very important. So that's a great job. I gotta remember to give you some bonus points for that. That was actually pretty good. All right, let's break down this next paragraph here. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintain it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them or controlling in any other manner their destiny by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition towards the United States. Okay, that was kind of a mouthful. What do you think, Mr. Josh? That was kind of a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I know who you are. I can't say your name. Legal. We're not supposed to say you guys' names. Oh, I know who you are. All right. When we talk about governments declaring independence, Mr. Josh, I want to pose that question to the group. When they say governments that have declared independence, who are they probably referring to? And I'll get back to you, Mr. Josh. Who are they probably referring to? But with the governments who have declared their independence, I'll give you a hint. They're referring to something going on in the Western Hemisphere. But with governments who have declared their independence. Ooh, somebody's getting kind of close. Not quite it. Remember, I said Western Hemisphere.
I don't even know.
Yo.
Yes, I don't even know.
You don't know?
No.
All right, so if I tell you the Western Hemisphere is in America, right? The Americas, North and South America. And we know that colonization happened from Europe. And now we're talking about governments who've declared their independence. What do you think is happening? We know what happened in America, right? America declared its independence. Oh, we lost him. Lost her. Dang. All right. Some shoddy connections in here, man. She was on to it. All right, help me out. You talking about, you said democracy. That's a big one, right? Democracy. What's going on? Who are we talking about, though?
We're talking I think we're talking about the Europeans. That's
Not quite.
me.
Not quite.
Uh,
I'll tell you what, think about your heritage. What was going on? We know that Americans declared their independence, but what else happened in the Americas?
a lot. Slavery.
Ho. Bring it back. Bring it back. You're almost there. So,
War.
was
Civil War.
America the only nation that declared its independence from its colonizer?
No.
No, right? So other countries, right, in the Americas also declared their what?
Their independence.
Their independence, right? And you said the D word, right? America
Yeah.
wanted those nations to be what? You said the D word earlier.
Democracy.
Democracy, democratic nations, right?
Yeah.
Because while we were in Europe at this time, Europe didn't have democracy. They had another D word, kind of rhymes with tater chips.
Huh?
Dick.
Uh,
Dictate.
I don't know.
Dictatorships, right?
Oh, dictatorship. Oh.
Dictatorships. All right, we'll get back to you. All right, I saw some people dropping some good stuff in the chat. Good job on the answers, guys. Let me pull Mr. Josh back in. We'll give you guys a little bit of a synopsis. All right, Mr. Josh, that map might be helpful right now. I think that we talk about America declaring its independence, but this was simultaneously happening with a lot of other nations in the Americas around the same time, was it not?
Yeah. So this photo right here, as we can see, it's from 1750, but it shows our point very well. As you can see in North America, if you can see my mouse, it's going to be over here. That's the 13 colonies. That's the United States. But all of these countries down here, these are colonies that are owned by Spain. Brazil was owned by Portugal, and some of the islands in the Caribbean were owned by France and Britain. So as we declare independence, as we become a democracy, a lot of these countries saw what we could do, and they saw that they could beat the armies of the Europeans, and they also declared independence.
Correct. Now, I want to pose this question to the class. Let's see if somebody can get this. It's going to take a little bit of abstract thinking here. The nations south of the American border primarily speak Spanish or Portuguese. Why is that? Why is that? I'm wondering if anybody can tell me. Why do you think the nations south of America primarily speak Spanish or Portuguese? And if you really want to extend that question, why is it that in parts of Canada they speak French, for instance, in Quebec, but in the rest they speak English? I want to pose that to the class really quickly and see if somebody can get that. I want to get you guys brains open. I'll call you back, Mr. Josh.
Go for it.
Why do the nations south of America, south of the United States of America, speak Spanish? And why do parts of Canada speak French and other parts speak English? What do you guys think? See if somebody can take an educated guess. Drop it in the chat, or if I call you, you can take an educated guess. Take a minute. I know we got a little lag on the responses here. All right. I'm seeing some good stuff getting dropped. All right, I think somebody got it, right?
Yeah.
Canada used to be a French colony and British colony, right? You had parts of Canada that were inhabited by the French and parts that were inhabited by the British. So when Canada got its independence, it still kept some of that French heritage, right? Which is why in Quebec they speak French, and in Montreal. South of the border, you had primarily Portuguese and Spanish colonies, right? And Portuguese and Spanish are very similar languages, but that's why south of the Americas, you'll get more Spanish and Portuguese because they were primarily Spanish and Portuguese colonies.
Yeah. And as we've been talking about this week, last week, and when we were back in school, with a lot of these countries, the country that ruled over them is what they speak. So Mexico was a colony of Spain, so they speak Spanish. Same thing for Costa Rica, the Dominican Republic, Panama, all of those countries, Peru, Argentina, Chile. And then for Brazil, it was a colony of the Portuguese. So they speak Portuguese. So what we see is a lot of the countries from Europe that colonized, their language from Europe was taught to the people in the colonies as a way of keeping control and making it easier to govern those areas.
Correct. Now, there's something that we saw differently with the colonization of the countries south of America versus what we saw in Canada and the Americas, Mr. Josh. And that was what I would call the integration and intermixing of people that kind of created a new culture. You didn't get that as much in America. So in America, you didn't get the integration of culture that created a new culture altogether that we kind of got south of America, right? Because when the Spanish and the Portuguese came, they didn't necessarily exterminate the native people. They ended up mixing with them in a lot of instances, which created a lot of diversity, right? And I'm wondering if anybody can tell me or just give me an indication or a clue as to why that might be. Why is it that in the Americas we didn't see Europeans come in and, let's say, intermingle with the natives and create a new culture, whereas we saw that south of the border? Drop it in the chat. Drop it in the chat if you have any ideas. It's kind of a higher order question. And Mr. Josh, in a few seconds, I want you to add your opinion on that question. I want to give people a chance to drop in there because that's something important to know when we're talking about the culture and the understanding. I think it's also important to know that when you look at allies, right, the fact that America was a British colony, Canada was a British colony as well, right? The relationship between Canada and America has always been incredibly close. We're close with Mexico, but we don't, let's say, have the same fundamental values as some of the countries south of America that we share with Canada, if that makes sense, because of the heritage. And that's something I think people need to think about. But Mr. Josh, what do you think? Why do we see those differences?
Yeah, so in the countries that were colonized by Britain, so we think Canada, some of the islands in the Caribbean like Jamaica, and the United States, we really don't see a mix between the Native Americans, the white settlers, and any African slaves that were brought over. And that's because, at least to my understanding, when these British people came over, they really didn't want to integrate. They didn't want to mix. They said, I live the way I do, and I'm going to go do that by myself. I'm going to live above everybody else because I'm proud of what I'm doing. And in the countries that were colonized by Spain, colonized by Portugal, there was still that I am better than everybody else belief, but it wasn't as strong. It wasn't as powerful. So they were okay with marrying people that didn't think or look like them. They were okay with the cultures and the communities being a little bit mixed because it meant that they could make more money. It meant that they could have more food, have more crops, or if they were doing something else to make money, they could do that easier. And it was more of a way of keeping control so that they could make the money that they needed to make to send it back home to whatever country that they came from originally.
Right. And I think that's just very important for you guys to understand as you're reviewing American history. And as you guys move forward, you're going to be in world history, then you're going to go into U.S. history and government courses. This is something I really need you guys to understand, that the overall belief system and the way in which different countries colonized the Americas had a lot to do with how these countries are today. Okay. So you have this system in America where you constantly had well-defined levels of classism, where you had Black people who were at the bottom as slaves. When Irish people immigrated over, right, they were in a lower class. When Asian people came over in the Pacific, helped build the railroad, they were of a lower class. It was frowned upon to mix. That was never really part of the belief system of those groups. And I would say that relates back to Great Britain. And you guys will learn about world history, what happened with Britain and its colonization around the world, right? So that's very important to know and understand. When you go to some of these countries, you'll see amazing diversity. You'll see Spanish-speaking people who are my complexion. You'll see Spanish-speaking people who are Mr. Josh's complexion. There's a lot more mixing And because of that, you have a new culture. Now, what I will say is when you take over a culture, there are typically imprints left somewhere. In the Americas, in the United States, you don't see the imprint as much from Native Americans, unfortunately. But what you do see is you do see some Spanish imprint from the original Spanish colonies, such as Florida, South Texas, New Mexico, right? And you'll also see culture from the French, because remember, the Louisiana Purchase, the Louisiana Territory, New Orleans, right, was originally a French colony. So when you think about things like that, there are cultural remnants from groups who were here before, but not the original groups. All right, so let's go ahead and continue here. We broke down kind of that first part where it's talking about independence. It says we cannot view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing. Involvement, interposition, involvement. That's important for you guys to know. They give you that definition of oppressing them, or uncontrolling in any other manner their destiny by any European power or any other light as the manifestation. So this, I think let's look at these last 3 lines here, Mr. Josh. I think this is very important. Once again, if you guys have the packet, make sure you're writing down notes so that when you're working on these questions, you remember this. It says, by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States. Okay? So essentially, what they're saying here is they don't want European nations interfering with the development of other nations in the Western Hemisphere. Would you agree with that, Mr. Josh?
Yeah. So as we've been talking about, the Monroe Doctrine says, you guys stay over here and we'll stay over here. All cool. And what this part is saying is that because that's what we're asking them to do, because that's the deal that we're making, if they cross that line, if they come over to our side, the only way that we're going to look at that is in a bad light. It's if they're trying to start something or they're trying to take something from us or steal.
Right, Mr. Josh. If you cross this line, we're going to have a problem, right? If you walk on my property, you're going to have a problem, right? That's kind of what's happening here. So that's important for you guys to know. Let's finish this last paragraph and summarize. So make sure, once again, you guys are taking notes. If you have any questions right now, drop them in there. Me and Mr. Josh will respond to your questions. We'll give you guys a minute or so just to do that. Some of you guys asked some really good questions. And I know we're going through a lot of information. This is super dense. You guys are doing a good job.
So
in the U.S.
Yeah,
there
so
are cultures in the U.S. So when we mean about cultural imprint, for instance, when you go to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, which is South Florida, you will see signs in Spanish and in English, right? And that has to do with, obviously, there being a lot of people of Spanish descent there, but that's a cultural mix. A lot of that's left over just from the fact that that was a Spanish colony, Florida, where they spoke Spanish originally. When you look at the style of food and even some of the language in Louisiana, right? The Creole culture, the Creole language, that is actually a mixture of like French and American style of cooking and style of talking and things of that nature. So you see some leftover remnants. You don't see it as much as you do when you go to other countries, let's say, south of America, but you see that.
Yeah, and someone also put Japanese culture is in the U.S. as well. Not as much here on the East Coast, partly because this isn't really where Japanese people came to live or to work. But if you go to California, if you go to San Francisco, there is definitely a major impact of Japanese and Chinese
Mr. Josh, you mind pulling
culture.
up the world map really quickly?
Yes.
And this is very important, guys, because I know, like, geographically, it's very important to understand where countries are situated because it really helps you understand how and why certain things have happened in integration, right? So when we think about Europe, Europe is to our east, right, across the Atlantic Ocean. When we look at the Asian nations, they are to our west in the Pacific, right? And we talked about this when we talked about coronavirus. We talked about where it would go first, right? We talked about it hitting New York first, it hitting California first, and that being because obviously if it started off in Asia, Asian countries, people from Asian countries would fly into California, Washington State, and Oregon, right, before they would fly, let's say, to Montana, right? Like they're going to fly into that coast. So Mr. Josh will put up this world map, right? This is the Asian Pacific, right? You got Japan, Mongolia, China, the Philippines, Indonesia, right? And the first stop in the Americas, which would be to their east, but to our west, would be California. So when you talk about why you see more Asian culture out west, you see that because that was the immediate entry of the Asians who immigrated or would come to the Americas, right? Just like you would see when you guys talk about the Irish in your U.S. history course one day, you'll see they came into New York, right? And when you look at Great Britain, that is to our east, right? And remember, European colonization, one of the easy ways to remember where it happened was because they landed on the East Coast. They didn't land on the West Coast. They landed on the East Coast because that was the closest coast. So that's important for you guys to remember. Mr. Josh, you want to add anything there?
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Even when people come here to work, or if they were forced over here to work, if they were forced into slavery, they didn't just bring the money that they made, or they didn't just bring the job that they worked. They brought their food, they brought their religion, they brought their culture and their music. So for a lot of the people that came to the United States for a better life, to make more money, they also gave us something. They gave us their passions and their culture. So there's a very interesting combination of all of these things in these areas where they settled down.
Right. And so as African American people, the majority of us in the class are African American. When slavery ended, you had something called a mass migration of African American people to the cities of the North, right? So that's why you see a lot of black people in the cities, right? A lot of black people in DC, a lot of black people in New York City, a lot of black people in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, right? These urban centers, right? Not so much when we go to Middle America, right? You don't see as much of a large concentration of African Americans. You'll also see large populations of African Americans in the southern cities, right? So if you were a slave, right, a lot of people, once they got freed from slavery, ended up congregating in these southern cities, Alabama, New Orleans, Birmingham, right? That was what took place. They would come to these cities looking for work, looking for more skilled labor and things of that nature. So these mass migrations and these movements of people are something that happened to every culture, And it's important for you guys to understand our culture as well as to how that impacted us. You had a lot of people who didn't want to stay in the South. They felt like it was dangerous. So a lot of them went west. So when you think about westward expansion, remember when slavery ended, we were still pushing west essentially, right? Like the West was not completely settled. So one of the options for an African American who didn't necessarily want to go north was to go west, right? They went west to California, right? To places like that, which is why we have a large concentration of African Americans in cities in the West. So that's something else I think you guys need to understand. Once again, make sure you're dropping any questions you have in the box below. The box, me and Mr. Josh will love to answer those questions. Want to make sure you guys have a great understanding of everything going on and also how it relates to you. So that's very important. Appreciate the participation. You guys are doing a pretty solid job. I'm going to go to this last paragraph right here, and we'll be done with the Monroe Doctrine for now. All right. It is impossible that the Allied powers, which are the European powers, should extend their political system to any portion of either Western Hemisphere continent without endangering our peace and happiness. Nor can anyone believe that our Southern brethren, if left to themselves, would adopt it or of their own accord. It is equally impossible, therefore, that we should behold such interposition in any form with indifference. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. It is still the true policy of the United States to leave the parties to themselves in hope of other powers will pursue the same course. Now, there's something in here that I thought was very, very interesting. Very, very interesting when they talk about Spain and its government. It says in the middle here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, paragraph, line 8. Line 8 here, line 7. It starts on line 7. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. What do you guys think that might mean? Drop that in the chat. What do you think that might mean? Let me keep that up. Actually. Because this is an interesting thing for Monroe to say. If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. Who is doing the subduing and who cannot be subdued? I'll call you back, Mr. Josh. Who is doing the subduing and who cannot be subdued? If we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain and those new governments and their distance from each other, it must be obvious that she can never subdue them. I wonder who's doing the subduing and who's going to be subdued. Maybe we can start there if you need to break it down. Who's doing the subduing and who is being subdued?
Hello again.
Hello. So who's doing the subduing?
Spain.
Spain is doing the subduing. And who is Spain trying to subdue?
The government, or I think
Not quite. Who would these new governments be? They would be what?
Europeans or
Not quite. Not quite. All right, we'll come back to you.
all right.
All right. Let's break this down. It says, if we look to the comparative strength and resources of Spain, right? Spain is a country in Europe, and those new governments and their distance from each other, saying that these new governments are far apart. These new governments are the nations in the Americas that have taken their independence from Spain. And Monroe is saying it's impossible for the Spanish or for Spain to control these new nations because of the distance. They will never subdue them. They will never take control of them. Mr. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, so as we've been talking about, the Atlantic Ocean keeps Europe away. It keeps them far apart from North and South America. So these new countries who are protected by that distance because they're so far away that Spain can't tell them what to do, are able to choose what type of government they want. And it asks the question, are they going to choose democracy or are they going to choose a dictatorship or a king? And the Monroe Doctrine says if they were to choose by themselves, we hope they would choose democracy. But if Spain starts talking to them again, if Spain starts trying to impact what they do, they might choose a king, and that would be bad for us as the United States.
Now, I want to foreshadow something that you guys are not unfortunately going to get a chance to learn about this year in my class because we don't go that far. What do you think is going to happen to nations that in the Americas, in the Western Hemisphere, that turn away from democracy? And I'll let you guys drop it in the chat. I won't call anybody. What do you think will happen to nations that turn away from democracy in the Western Hemisphere? Western Hemisphere being the Americas, North and South America. A country that says, you know what? I hear you talking about this democracy thing and the whole. We're not with it. We want to stay a dictatorship. We actually think we like dictatorship. What do you think might happen to those nations that choose that in the Americas? Take an educated guess, guys. I'm gonna give you a couple minutes to think about it. Drop it in. I know there's a lag on the chart as well. But what do you think is going to happen? The U.S. wants countries in the Western Hemisphere to be democracies, but not every country is going to choose democracy. What do you think will happen to nations that don't choose democracy? There are a few different things that could happen and have happened you're going to learn about.
Because remember, all of these countries that we didn't like in Europe, Britain, Spain, France, Portugal, all of these countries were monarchies. They didn't let the people vote, and we disliked them. So we're asking the question, if countries close to us that are much closer to us and impact us more, if they have a government that is like those monarchies, is a dictatorship, are we going to like that, or are we not going to like that? Are we going to try to maybe combat that or change it?
Drop it below. Drop it below. Or I'm going to play the flu hating rap. You don't want that. It's going to happen. Okay, so while we're waiting on that, Mr. Josh, I would argue that as an American, if a nation in our hemisphere chooses not to embrace democracy, that they are now an immediate threat to the safety of we as Americans. Because we can't trust you if you're not a democratic government. If you're not a democratic government and you're a dictatorship in our hemisphere, not only do we not trust you, but you may perhaps side with other nations that have your form of government. What do you think about that statement, Mr. Josh?
Yeah, we've definitely seen that happen before. Sadly, you guys won't get to learn about this, but in the 1960s, Cuba decided to reject democracy. They went down a different path, and they sided with a country that we were very against. They sided with the Soviet Union. And because they were friends with the Soviets, they were friends with the people that we didn't like, we were scared that the Cubans were going to be a base, or they were going to help the Soviets. So we got very scared, we got very defensive, and there was almost a war fought over how close to the US our enemies were. So we definitely take action against countries that are close to us in North and South America that disagree with us on how to run the government, because we're scared that they're going to come after us.
Now, there are two ways in which countries typically take action against other countries in the modern era, Mr. Josh. I'm going to ask the class right now, what are the two ways in which you think a country might take action against another nation? If I'm America and I have an issue with Nicaragua, let's say, what are two things that will happen? There's usually one of two things, and this is important because in modern contexts, as you guys get older and understand the economy and things like that, these are the same two ways in which things are handled to this day, and one is actually more prominent than the other. War is one of them. Now, what's the other? What's the other one that may not involve war but can be equally as devastating to a nation? It's something we talk about all the time. When we think about these American wars, what were they fought over? Why were these American wars fought? It had to do with something. There's an R word, there's a T word, there's an M word that I would accept at this point. M word, R word, T word. Resources, absolutely. Resources.
Because remember,
right? So, Mr. Josh is frozen. Back. Right. Cutting off resources. So a lot of countries may rely on you for trade, or maybe they rely on another nation for trade. And maybe you cut that country's ability to trade off. You sanction them. You tell Cuba that they are not allowed to sell rice to Nicaragua or something like that. Or you cut off some sort of plot, money as well. That's a good way to put it, right? So in the modern era, we don't always go fight a war. We go hit you where it hurts. We cut off trade. We cut off your ability to support your people. And then what happens is your society starts to, let's say, disintegrate from within. So I would even place the argument that some of you guys have probably asked the question, like, why is it that Americans are just now allowed to go to Cuba and visit Cuba, and we're just beginning to open up relationships with Cuba? Well, the United States kind of had a failed invasion on Cuba. They didn't want to do an all-out war. But after that, they sanctioned Cuba. They refused to trade with Cuba, even though Cuba is very, very close to the United States in proximity. So that's an example. Mr. Josh, you had something you were talking about.
Yeah, because of how the world is in 2020, if we have disagreements with countries, we can't just start swinging every time we disagree, because that's just not how the world works. He was saying we stop trading with them, we give them less money, we make sure that other people don't trade with them. The idea is that because it hurts them, because it hurts their ability to be a society, to give their people the stuff they need, that the citizens, the individuals that make up that country will start pushing and saying, hey, clearly our leaders are doing something wrong, because why are these people telling us we can't get these TVs, or we can't travel, or we can't get these other things? So they push for those changes that other countries want to see. And that's what we did with Cuba after we almost fought them. We said, we don't like your government. We're going to try to change the government by asking the people to do it. We're going to stop selling and buying things with you. so that the citizens get angry or they get hype enough to go push for those changes.
All right. And this is important not just internationally, but it's also important regionally. So, for instance, in politics and in our own government, right? The United States supplies a certain amount of funding, federal funding, national funding to certain states and certain programs within certain states. There are times, unfortunately, in our nation where if someone disagrees with the president or a president, that president may cut funding to programs that may help a certain state. We see that right now going on with a lot of the governors. We see a lot of governors who are treading quite lightly in the way that they talk about the administration because they're expecting help. Now, on the flip side, with the Affordable Care Act, you had states that did not accept the expansion of Medicare and Medicaid, such as North Carolina, where I used to teach. So they refused to take the funding. So I want you guys to understand that nowadays, people are less likely to fight than they are to hit someone in their pockets, right? If I have a disagreement with Mr. Josh, I'm going to sue him. The United States has the issue of Japan. They're going to affect trade with Japan, right? If a state is going rogue and not doing what's expected by, let's say, the executive branch, funding that state might be cut. Mr. Josh, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, and it's not just countries that do that. It can be people. So if y'all have ever heard about people boycotting a company, not buying their products, it's exactly the same thing. If I don't like how Nike or another big company treats their workers, or they say something politically that I disagree with, or they believe something that I don't, I can go out and say, I can't get you to stop selling your things, but I'm not going to buy it. I'm going to try to force you to lose money so that you change what you believe in. And that's very important so that you can push back against those bad things.
Yeah, and it's 1:45. So I'm not playing a flu hating rap. I'm just going to introduce you guys to my adorable niece, Erin. I got Erin. Hey, Avery.
Just want to say, y'all did a wonderful job today.
Yeah, I did.
Good answer, good participation. Very proud of y'all. Keep up the good work.
Yeah.
Can you help
And
me?
everybody who's in here is definitely getting
Can you help me
the extra
find my
credit
bag?
points a little later. Oh,
Oh, and for the record, whoever's geeking on me about my coffee, it's actually tea. So I'm gonna just sip on this tea. No big deal.
Yep.
That's just me. But good work today, y'all. I shall see y'all later.
All right, guys. Make sure you guys DM me your work and also about how adorable my niece and goddaughter are. All right. Extra credit for that. Peace.
Bye.